Savvy Swifters, we're going to start working on the to-do list, and up first, we're going to learn about table views. We're going to build a very simple table view. We're going to learn about table views cells, identifiers, using delegates and data sources. We'll learn about protocols in Swift, extensions, and we'll learn about dequeuing reusable cells. Now, after we learn some new and somewhat complicated concepts, we're going to go ahead and build another table view app to keep track of European nations. With that said, folks, let's get at it. Giddy up. The table view is one of the most important user interface concepts in iOS, and in this video we're going to learn how to set up a table view that can show a varying number of rows or cells that the user can scroll through. And you see this kind of table view in all sorts of apps. While we're going to be setting this up in our to-do app, you're also going to be building table views when you work on the Weather Gift app. That's going to show the daily temperature on a portion of the screen. You'll see it in the Snacktacular app that you're going to build, where the table view will show restaurant reviews. And you see these kinds of table views with a dynamically allocated number of cells in all sorts of Apple apps. Shown here is the Shortcuts app with some pretty customized cells that vary by color, the Settings app where the cells grow or shrink depending on the number of apps that are installed, and the Contacts app that has cells organized in sections for the letters of the alphabet. Now, our table views are going to be single section table views, but there's a lot of flexibility available to the app developer. Now, even though table views are so important, they are notoriously tough for new app developers to understand. There are a lot of new concepts, a lot of new terms, and it typically takes a while to understand what's going on under the hood. But in these videos, what we'll do is we'll learn how to set up table views. I'll describe the code and concepts, but I'll also show you that a lot of the code that we write can be copied and reused with very little modification from project to project. So let's get at it. This is what your app's going to look like at the end of this video. We'll have a basic table view set up with some dynamically allocated cells. We'll put some dummy data in there. You'll learn a bunch of the concepts in table views, and we'll build the app out from here. So let's start our step-by-step approach with the user interface. When you want to create a new scrolling table view, you first add the table view object to the view controller. You add a table view cell to the table view. You set the cell's identifier attribute, and you create an IB outlet for the table view. You don't need one for the table view cell. So let's launch Xcode, create a new project, single view iOS app. We'll give it the name of to-do list. I'll save mine right to the desktop, expand the screen, and let's get into main storyboard. Now I'll click on library and type in the word table in the object filter. You see a bunch of different options here, and the one that you want is table view. Make sure that you don't click on the one that says table view controller. The one that says table view controller will actually give you a full view controller with the table view built in, but it's also going to limit what you can do. So even though you might see some tutorials that use this for dynamic or scrollable table views, I suggest you never use the table view controller when you want to do scrollable table views. Instead, just use the techniques we're about to show you. They're a lot more flexible, they take the same amount of work, and you'll never be limited or have to go back and do rework. Now, we will see the table view controller show up for static table views. Those are table views that have a fixed number of cells and they look more like forms, but we'll cover those in a future video. So just click a table view object, drag it over and drop it into a view controller, then click add new constraints, and we'll set top, left, right, and bottom all to 0 and add those 4 constraints. The table view will expand out and be anchored to the safe area. Next, we need to add a table view cell inside of our table view, and you could click on library and drag this item over that says table view cell, but instead what I'm going to do is make sure that my table view is clicked, go into the attributes inspector, and I'll set this prototype cells attribute to 1. Then you'll see this thing that says prototype cells inside. That's actually where the data in our cells is going to go. It doesn't look like it's going to be rendered on the screen, but that's okay. Then go over in the document outline and make sure that you click not on table view, but table view cell. And then we're going to go into the attributes inspector, and under identifier, we're going to give it a special name that we'll refer to in our code. And typically we're going to use capital C, lowercase ell. Once you give it an identifier name, you'll notice over in the document outline where it said table view cell, now it says the identifier name of cell. Now we'll be using the identifier in our code, so you'll want to make sure that you remember it. Most developers will put the word cell in their identifier and usually write it in upper camel case. We'll stick with cell for now. Next, over in the project navigator, click on viewcontroller.swift, option click on main storyboard, so we're in assistant editor mode, and then you want to click on the table view, not the cell, but the table view. Control drag over, we're going to create an IB outlet for just the table view, and we're going to call that lower camel case table view, capital V in view. Click connect. I'm going to close our main storyboard and get back into viewcontroller.swift in the editor mode, and since we're going to have more than one view controller in this app, why don't we change the name of view controller? Since it's going to show a list of data in our to-do list, why don't we call it to-do list view controller? So double click the word view controller next to class, right click, select refactor, rename, and just type over this to-do list view controller and press enter. That's it. And so now we've got the bare bones table view user interface set up. we need to get some data ready so that we can put that into the cell. So we're going to be setting up what's called a data source. It's just going to be an array of data, and for now we'll just put in some dummy placeholder data so that we can make sure our table view is showing and we've got data in the cells. So I'm going to have an array of data that's going to hold the to-do items in this app, and I'm going to call that to-do array. So let's create a class-wide variable var to-do array equals, and then our brackets, and then inside I'll put in 4 strings just as placeholders for now. Learn Swift, build apps, change the world, take a vacation. Feel free to add your own. Next up, we need to set up our code to be the data source and the delegate for our table view. And this is what we mean by that. Now, iOS gives us a lot of built-in functionality with the table view that we don't need to write any code for at all. But one area where iOS is going to need some help is it's going to need some data. Otherwise, the table view's got nothing inside it. So the table view is going to say, hey, I'm going to need some data view controller. Can you set me up? The view controller code that we write can say, sure, I'll refer to myself using self as the data source. And we'll do this right inside of view.did_load. So we're going to add this line that says TableView.dataSource equals self. And that's the way for our Swift code file to say, hey, table view, I'm going to be your data source. I got your data right here. Also, the table view is going to need some help for some other stuff. For example, a table view doesn't know how many rows of data exist, so it might send a message back that says, hey, tell me how many rows there are in the data. Also, as the table view lays out these vertically scrolling cells, it's not going to be able to do all that on its own. So it's going to delegate a task to our code and say, hey, create a new cell for me, put the data inside it, and send it back. I'll put it in the scrollable list. Or in another example, the table view might send a message over to our code that says, hey, I'm about to move a cell. I'm going to let you know where I'm rearranging my cell so that you can rearrange the data that's supposed to be inside the cell, and we'll be in sync. Now, in each of these cases, iOS, and in this case, TableView in particular, is going to be delegating tasks to our code. Now, Apple has defined a bunch of these functions that can listen in for system events. So we'll add some of them to our code. Specifically, we'll add ones that listen for requests from a TableView. And inside the body of these functions, we'll write our custom code so we can give back the TableView exactly what it needs. Now, delegation is really common in iOS. Swift is specifically built for it. You're going to see it come up in other apps as well. If this sounds a bit confusing, we'll do some examples in just a bit. But for now, what we need to do is we need the code to declare, yes, I'm going to be your delegate TableView. And the way we're going to do this is we're just going to add one more line to viewcontroller.swift that says TableView.delegate equals self. So back in view.did_load, I'm going to add both of those lines, TableView.delegate equals self, TableView.dataSource equals self. Notice that it's lower camel case, so S is capitalized. And self, again, refers to the class that we're inside of. That's our view controller. In this case, it's called to-do list view controller. So that delegate line says, hey, I'm going to have some code in here that's going to listen in TableView for your requests, and I'll get those things done. Now, we're getting some errors in here. That's Xcode's way of saying, hey, you want to work with TableViews? You're going to need a little bit more. Another new concept. So what we're going to have to do now is adopt the protocols UITableView dataSource and UITableView delegate. What does that mean? Well, really what a protocol is a set of upfront rules that say, hey, if you want a specific functionality or you want to perform a specific set of tasks in your code, you're going to need to perform these things. Maybe it's declare some variables, use some data structures, or adopt some specific functions or methods. But a protocol will both remind you that you need these things and prevent your code from running unless you include them. So you can think of protocol as sort of like an enforcement cop. I'm the protocol police. You want to be able to be the delegate in a data source for a table view? Then you need to adopt the rules for protocols. And those two rules are UITableView delegate and UITableView data source. Now I'll show you how we go ahead and adopt these two protocols. Xcode will then remind us that we need two functions, and it'll even offer to write the outlines of these functions for us too. Now, since this protocol is going to tell me I need to adopt some specific TableView functions, I'm going to organize them in a special place in my code. I'm going to create what's called an extension. So after the last curly brace of class, we've never done this before, but we're going to add some additional code. We're going to type in the word extension, then we're going to type in the name of the class, to-do list view controller, : and after this is where we adopt the two protocols we're going to use. These are called UITableView delegate, then UITableView data source. The order doesn't matter. Then do open and close curlies. Now again, the protocol says, hey, if you want to be the delegate and data source, there are certain rules you need to follow. And the error that we're getting now says you need to include a couple of functions. That's specifically what it's saying when it says we don't conform to the protocol. But what's great is if we click on the little red ball here, Xcode will offer to write the outlines of these functions. That's what it means by adding stubs. So let's click fix and say, okay, Xcode, go ahead and write the stubs. And now here are the two required iOS functions that the protocol demands we include in our code that are going to listen in from messages from the table view. And this first one, number of rows in section, happens when the table view sends a message and says, hey, delegate, Tell me how many rows you got for me. By the way, another pro tip, in the same way that you can option click on top of values and see the type, you can also click on any of these predefined function names, and it'll bring up a summary of the function. So here we see, hey, this function that we just clicked on tells the data source, which is self, which means our to-do list view controller, to return the number of rows in a given section of a table view. Well, we've only got one section, so we can ignore that part. So we want to return the number of rows. How do we find the number of rows? That's going to be the count of the to-do array. Notice also that there's an arrow with an int after it in the function. That means this function wants a return value that's an int. So I'll just click down here, go into the body of the function, and type return to-do-array.count. Now let's option click on this next function that says self or row@at on it. And this says, asks the data source, and remember that source of the data is the to-do list view controller code, for a cell to insert in a particular location of the table view. So this is the table view saying, hey, I need a cell, and I need some data inside of it. Set me up. Notice what's being returned here, a UITableView cell. So we're going to create a cell. How do we know the location? Well, when the TableView calls this function, it's going to pass in what's called an index path. That's going to give us the row of the data in the array that we need to pass back in the cell. Let's do it. So to create that cell, let's create a constant, let cell equals, and this is how we create a cell. We'll type in TableView dot, and then start to type in dequeue. That's DEQUE, and you'll see three different options come up here that say dequeue reusable cell. We want to choose the one that says with identifier for index path. Now here's what's going on, and we have to get into the weeds just a little bit here. Your app isn't going to create a cell for every single row in the table. If you have 100,000 rows, you're not going to create 100,000 cells. iOS only wants to create the number of cells that you can see on screen. And what it's going to do is it's going to reuse those cells. So if you scroll down, the cell that scrolls off the top will immediately be recycled or reused to hold the data that's scrolling up from the bottom. Same thing if you scroll in the other direction. And this is really smart because while we need to keep track of 100,000 pieces of data, we don't need 100,000 cells keeping track of 100,000 text labels with text label color, with text labels dimensions and fonts. Instead, what iOS does is it says, I'm only going to create the cells for what you can see on screen. And when I need a new cell, I'm going to dequeue or recycle one of those cells that just scrolled off that we're not using anymore. So how do we set up that cell recycling? We use this function TableView.dequeueReusableCell. That's all this is. Get me a cell and reuse one if one's available. So again, highlight this dequeueReusable cell with the identifier for index path and press return. Now we want to create a cell, and the way that our code is going to find the blueprint for the cell is it will look on the main storyboard for the cell that we set up with a particular identifier. Now we only have one cell, but we gave that the identifier attribute of CELL. So in quotes here, because it wants a string, we're going to say capital C, lowercase ELL. So now what about the index path? Well, that's the location where the TableView needs to put this cell. And the TableView actually tells us the index path. It's right in here in the function definition. So when this function gets called by the TableView and our code picks this up because it's the delegate, we can just use this index path right in here. So I'm going to type in index path, lower camel case. So now we created the cell in the cell constant. We're going to go ahead and return the cell. Now we need to do something in between where we actually put data inside of the cell, but I like to say return cell right after I create the cell constant because that'll silence an error in Xcode that'll say, hey, you need to return the cell. So type return space cell, spelled the same way that you did when you set up the constant. You can option click on top of it and notice that it says, yep, it's a UITableView cell, which is exactly what this function is expecting after the return arrow. And now we need to do one more thing before we return the cell. So I'm going to add another line in between the let and the return cell. And this is where we actually put data inside of a label that's inside of the cell. So if we say cell dot, we'll have access to all of the objects that are part of that cell. Now this is a default cell that we can use that Apple sets up for us. We'll learn how to customize these later on. But there is a label attached to the cell that we didn't see on main storyboard. But if you type in dot text, you'll see text label shows up here. The description says the label used for the main textual content of the table cell. That's what we want. So highlight that one and press return. Then type .text, and then we'll say equal. We'll set the text attribute equal to our to-do array, and then in brackets, the element that we want is going to be indexPath.row. What indexPath.row is going to be is it's going to say, hey, get the exact row, the exact index of the element in to-do array that you want to display. Once that's set up, we return the cell, it's going to magically appear inside of our app. Now we'll get an error in here that says, hey, text label isn't optional. It is possible that you could go in there and delete text label so that it doesn't exist. We didn't do that. The way that you can fix it is exactly as proposed. It'll put a question mark after label, click fix, we'll be good to go. Now let's try to get a sense of what's really going on behind the scenes. So why don't we put in a print statement in both of these two functions and see by looking at the console when these functions are being called. So in the first function, number of rows in section, I'm going to put in print, number of rows in section was just called, returning, string interpolation, and I'll put toDoArray.count in there. And I'll also put an emoji, cool smiley, because I think it's kind of cool that this is executing. Then in the function below this, just before I set up the cell, I'll type in print, cell for row at was just called for index path equals string interpolation, and I'm going to put in indexPath.row, which is the cell containing string interpolation toDoArray bracket indexPath.row. And I'll put the row emoji in front since we're talking about rows here. So hopefully you can see this will show us the data that's actually showing up when our table view is making a request of our code, which is the delegate, to give it back a cell. So now I'll build and run on an iPhone 11 Pro. Our app has a cell for each of the elements in our to-do array. That's expected, looking good. Now let's expand the console in the debug area and take a look at what printed out. This looks kind of weird, but it's actually normal. Number of rows in section is called 3 times. You might say, why 3 times? Well, it's actually triggered by iOS. Even though it shows up 3 times, that's okay. We're giving it the correct information each time. We're returning 4. And the 4 is because there are 4 rows in our to-do array, which is where we get our data from. Then what happens? Well, our table view makes a call to our code, which is its delegate, and it says, hey, I need a cell for row at a particular index path. The first time it makes the call, the index path passed in has a .row attribute, which is 0. Match that up in our to-do array with element 0, which is learn Swift. The next one is indexPath.row1, which is build apps. The third one is 2, which is change the world. And the fourth one is 3, which is take a vacation. This is looking good. It's functioning exactly the way we want it to. So the code we have is pretty new. Let's go ahead and just make sure that we understand what's going on. First, what we do is we create an array, which is going to hold the data that's going to be inside of the cells of our table view. Then we declare TableView delegate and TableView dataSource to self. Self means the view controller. That means the table view can send messages back delegating things that our code should do. And below in the extension, we're going to write the required functions so that the table view can delegate to our code. And the data source means, hey, the view controller is where you're going to get the data. The view controller refers to itself as self. Then down here, we set up an extension. And we put in these 2 protocols. The protocols are the rules that require us to do certain things if we're going to be using the table view in the way that we're setting it up here. Specifically, we add UITableView delegate and UITableView dataSource. Now, once we put this in, Xcode gave us an error, but it said, hey, I can put in the stubs or I can put in the outlines for the code that you're going to need. These are the required functions. The 2 functions are down here. This first one, number of rows in section, needs to have returned the number of rows in the array that's holding all the data that's going to be inside of our table view. This second one is called whenever the table view needs to reuse one of the cells that it sees on screen. So what we're doing here is we're saying, okay, let's create a cell. We're going to find the cell on our storyboard with the identifier capital CELL, and we'll use that as the prototype or the template for setting up our new cell. We're going to set it up at the index path that's being passed in at the top of this function. Then we're going to go in the cell that we just created, and we're going to use the default text label that Apple gives us. We're going to set its text attribute to to-do array, and then in brackets, the way we find the element we need to send in is at indexPath.row. So that'll give the exact element that this cell needs to display. Then we return the cell. Now, even though this looks kind of hairy, here's the good news. If you're going to do pretty much the same kind of scrollable table view with these dynamically allocated cells, this is what's going to change. The stuff that's highlighted in yellow is just the name of the view controller. And in our case, we actually changed the name of our view controller to to-do list view controller. So these 2 spots that you see here in the class definition and in the extension are the only places where you would change those names if you had a different name for your view controller. Second, you're probably going to have a different data source in here. So you're going to set up a new variable with different data in it. It's probably going to have a different name. You're going to refer to that variable in number of rows in section in your return. And you're also going to refer to it when you get the data that you're going to put inside of the text label. Those are the only things that are going to change. And given that, why don't we go ahead and have a quick challenge so that you can make sure you've got this down. And here's your challenge scenario. The European Union is in turmoil and EU leaders have hired you to write an app that will allow them to keep track of current members. For now, simply create an app with a simple table view listing the member countries, and you can find a list at this URL. Now create an Xcode project named EU, include an array of string values named members that lists the name of each country. set up the table view so that all the countries are listed in the table view cells, and add print statements used in this video's project so that you can see how dequeuing cells works with more data than is shown on a single screen. Give it a shot. Pause. Hopefully you got it. Resume. Let's see. Well, this is how incredibly easy this is going to be. We'll do File, New, Project, Single View App, iOS App, Next, give it the name EU, Next, save it to the desktop, create, and expand Xcode to full screen. Now get into the main storyboard, open the library, find a table view and drag it onto your canvas right onto your view controller. Click on Add New Constraints and set 4 constraints to 0, 0, 0, 0 for top, left, right, and bottom, and add those 4 constraints. Then I'll click in the table view, go into the Attributes Inspector, and make sure that I set the number of prototype cells to 1. Then I'm going to click on the table view cell, and I'm going to set its identifier to capital CELL. Press Enter. Now let's get into Assistant Editor mode, so I'll click on ViewController.Swift, Option click on Main Storyboard, so these files are side by side. Then I'm going to Control drag from Table View over onto my ViewController.Swift. I'm going to name this IB outlet Table View, lower camel case with a capital V. Click Connect. Then I can close Main Storyboard, and why don't I go ahead and create that members variable. So right under the outlet, I'm going to say var members equal open bracket. Then I'm going to head over to the URL that I gave you, which is bit.ly/euro-swift. Now we got more data than we need right now, but we're just going to copy all of these values underneath countries, the 28 country names. They are conveniently enclosed in double quotes with commas after them. After you copy them, return to Xcode, paste them right after the open bracket, put a close bracket right afterward. And I'll clean up indenting by doing Command-A, Control-I. Then in view.load, I'll get rid of the comment. I'll type in TableView.delegate equals self and TableView.dataSource equals self. If you type faster than code completion, make sure that your S in dataSource is capitalized. Then after the last curly in the class, we're going to add extension. So we'll type in extension space. And if you go up here, we can see that we're keeping the name ViewController for this file. So I'll just type in ViewController, and we'll adopt these 2 protocols, which are UITableView Delegate and UITableView dataSource. If you just type TableView Delegate and TableView dataSource, those will pop up in code completion. In just about a second, Xcode pops up and says that we are not conforming to the protocols, but if we click on red, click on Add Stubs, Xcode will add the definitions of these functions for us. First function wants the number of rows in sections, so we just put in return members.count. The second function down here is where we set up our cell, so we'll say let cell equal. Then this is TableView.dequeueReusable cell. We'll select that option with identifier. The identifier is cell, and for index path, we'll put an index path in lower camel case. We can say return cell right underneath it, and then the line in between we say cell.textLabel.text equals, and this is going to be members, and in brackets it's going to be indexPath.row. There should be a question mark after text label. If there's not, you can go ahead and add that. And now I could type in my print statements as we were asked in the challenge, but you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my other code. I'm going to copy the entire extension from the to-do list app, and I'm going to paste it over the extension that I just typed in, just to show you that this stuff really is like a recipe, and all we need to do is change those elements that I highlighted in the earlier slide. So now that I pasted this into my EU code, I'm just going to change every place that referred to to-do array with the word members, which is our array in this app. And Xcode will help us out by flagging all those errors because there's nothing called to-do array in our EU app. Then I'll go ahead and build and run. So here's something to note. We have more countries than we can display on all of the cells that are showing in our app. If we adjust the console, we can see, yep, we're still calling number of rows in section 3 times, but this time we're returning 28 each time because we've got 28 elements in the array. And then take a look at all of these cell for row at calls. Look at how many we've got. We've got 0 through 16. So we printed out 16 times. Let's count up how many cells there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. I should have counted from 0 for 0 indexing. That's one call to cell for row at for every single row that we're showing on screen. But now look what happens if I click and drag the table view up. I can see that cell for row at is being called, and the cells that scrolled off screen are being recycled for 17, 18, 19. And if I scroll it in the other direction, I can see that it wants row 1, 0. So this is a great way to see what's actually going on and when Xcode is requesting cell for row at when it dequeues a reusable cell. That's delegation in action. And this is in the reference section for the online text, but I wanted to show it in a slide here. So I'd say well over 90% of the students that come to office hours and say, hey, my table view doesn't work. Can you help me out? It's one of the problems that you see here. So you want to check on the main storyboard. Do you have a table view in your view controller? Do you have a table view cell? Did you set the identifier for the table view cell in the attributes inspector? We usually call it cell. In the Swift file, which is by default viewcontroller.swift, but you may rename this, did you create an IB outlet for the table view? We usually call it table view, lower camel case. Did you create a class-wide data structure, typically an array, to hold the data that we will display in our table view? Did you set a delegate and a data source? This way, TableView.delegate and dataSource to self. We usually do that in viewDidLoad. If you don't do this, you will see an empty table view. So you want to make sure that you add these two lines. If you forget them, you won't get an error, but you won't see your data. Did you create an extension and give it the same name as your view controller, which is important if you renamed the viewcontroller.swift file? Did you include a number of rows in section with the return count of the data source array? Did you include a cell for row@, with 3 lines to create, set up, and return the cell? Did you use the same with identifier name? Case is important when you set up the table view cell identifier in the attributes inspector. Hopefully you got all this right. Hopefully you never even have to look at this because your table views are always working pristinely and flawlessly. That said, you are now table view talents. Congratulations, Swifter. Keep at it.